This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, beginning at verse 9 through verse 13, and then skipping ahead verses 18 to 26. It's the basis for the sermon here at First Free Methodist Church on June 11, 2023. It's the third message in our series called Renew, about how we build a Spirit-centered life. Before we begin, let's hear the text from Matthew chapter 9. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible. It's 2020 revision. Again, Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and began dining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy that need a physician, but those who are sick. Now go and learn what this means. I desire compassion rather than sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And then skipping ahead down to verse 18. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a synagogue official came and bowed down before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will become alive again." Jesus got up from the table and began to accompany him along with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched him on the border of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will get well." But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well." And at once the woman was made well. Now when Jesus came to the official's house and saw the flute players and the crowd and noisy disorder, he said, "Leave, for the girl has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But when the crowd had been sent out, he entered and took her by the hand, and the girl got up, and this news spread throughout that land. In this particular episode of Passages, we're skipping over a section in the middle of this scripture reading. You probably noticed verses 14 all the way down to verse 17. This is a separate teaching of Jesus about fasting that is not being covered as part of the sermon for this particular week in June or with the podcast. So we're just focusing on these stories of the calling of Matthew and these miracles of healing that Jesus participated in. Let's just start with the calling and the company of Matthew. Now, Jesus had been teaching in his hometown of Capernaum. He called a disciple to follow him named Matthew. Matthew is, the title is often referred to by Levi in some of the other Gospels. The word Matthew in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus and his disciples would have spoken in his public ministry, Matthew means gift of God. Now, Matthew was engaged in tax collecting. And tax collecting was a somewhat complicated affair in the ancient world because there were taxes that were collected as part of the Jewish religious establishment, especially in Jerusalem. There were other taxes that were collected, of course, by the Romans as part of the Roman Empire. In this case, Matthew is part of the establishment of the Roman Empire's collection of taxes. He's a Jewish man, but he's employed by the Romans for tax collecting. Now, these taxes that were collected were part of what we would describe in the 21st century in the United States as a pyramid scheme. There is a way in which Matthew would purchase a tax liability from the Romans. In other words, purchase like a tax lease. So the Romans would say, okay, well, this section of people, you need to collect a tax from them. And it could either be people who live in a geographic area. It could be people who are passing through on a highway. It could be a place where there's perhaps some maritime exchange, which this is likely the case since Jesus is near Capernaum of the Sea of Galilee, Matthew could have been employed as one of these individuals who collects taxes from boats moving back and forth across the sea. So Matthew would purchase a tax lease with a certain amount of money that he would pay the Romans up front. Then he would have to then go and collect those taxes in a sense to reimburse himself. Oftentimes tax collectors would employ others to help collect those taxes, and with each addition or layer of individuals employed in the collecting of taxes, the tax burden would go up because tax collectors made their living by adding whatever amount they saw fit to the tax that was required of people so that they would have their income. Well, of course, you would imagine tax collectors, like Matthew and others, exploited this for their own benefit. There was several problems that people had with tax collectors in Jesus' day. One of them, of course, is that these tax collectors would often extort extra money from people well beyond the taxes that were required, simply because the tax collectors were greedy. But another complication for tax collectors had to do with the fact that they transacted business in Roman currency with Romans or Gentiles. And so this proximity relationship of these Jewish tax collectors who were employed by the Romans created a wall, if you will, or a barrier between them and the rest of the Jewish religious community, because they associated closely with Gentiles. They used Roman money, which for the most pure Jewish observance, they wouldn't handle Roman money or keep it because it had the image of Caesar on the coin, and so they believed it to be a practice of idolatry, and so they would not want to hold or have Roman money. All of this is to say that when Jesus comes and calls Matthew, of course, he's calling a person to be his disciple who's well onto the margin. While Matthew is wealthy and a tax collector and is well networked, Jesus is still calling somebody who is really on the outs of Jewish community. Matthew, of course, responds by following him. And it's much like the story of Zacchaeus that we read in Luke's gospel. Zacchaeus also was a tax collector. Now, at some point in time in this story, Jesus is at Matthew's house. Now, we don't know if it's at the same moment or the same time or a sequential event, or maybe it was days or even weeks later. But there's a time at which Jesus is gathered together in Matthew's house, and there's quite the guest list there that we read about in Matthew's gospel. It says in verse 10, "Then it happened that Jesus was reclining at the table in the house. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and began dining with Jesus and his disciples." The tax collectors that were at this meal, easy enough. These are others either working with Matthew or working for Matthew. And so Matthew throws a dinner party, much the same way as Zacchaeus does, as kind of an evangelistic gathering. Matthew wants all of his peers and his lieutenants to meet Jesus, who called him. But then it says there were sinners there, and this is where it gets a little harder to define who these people are. If we were to just move along the line of assumption, again, speculation, these are probably bankers or other financiers who charged interest in loans. Now, under Jewish law, the charging of interest was illegal. And so these would have been more shady financiers who charged an interest rate on money that they lent. And so this gathering at Jesus that Jesus is participating in with his disciples is probably a gathering of some extraordinarily wealthy people who are all gathered in his house, and Jesus is sharing a meal. Well, the Pharisees, these are Jewish religious leaders kind of in the synagogue or rabbinic tradition, they ask Jesus' disciples, why is Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners? Jewish law, or at least the law as the Pharisees understood it, forbade them from eating with Gentiles. The act of eating or dining in this ancient Near Eastern culture, it implies intimacy. It also applies acceptance, that you would never have anyone as your guest for dinner who wasn't already deemed socially acceptable. And so the Pharisees, rather than approaching Jesus, approach his disciples to get an answer to this question as to why is Jesus keeping company over a meal with these types of individuals. Well, Jesus, of course, hears them, and he defines his role by addressing their question. He says, it's the sick that actually need a physician. The underlying strategy of the Pharisees overall, throughout Matthew's gospel especially, is exclusion and condemnation. That there's a group of people that you should be associating with. There's groups, of course, you should not be associating with. Jesus never embraces this strategy. As a matter of fact, he confronts it on many different occasions. Jesus favors proximity and presence and even healing over kind of marginalization and exclusion. Jesus speaks his most condemning words to the Pharisees later in this very Gospel of Matthew to help understand the contrast between the way in which the Pharisees, or the religious leaders of his day, approached individuals versus how Jesus approached individuals. Jesus is essentially asking a rhetorical question, is how will sinners ever be made whole if they're not in the presence of the one who can make them whole? And he insults the religious leaders in verse 13. He says, now go and learn what this means. And he quotes a passage of scripture here, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice. When Jesus tells them to go and learn, he's treating the Pharisees, who are religious leaders, as if they're unstudied in their own discipline. These are rabbis. And so he basically tells the rabbis, you should go back to school and read this again, that God desires compassion over sacrifice. Now, sacrifice is not discarded, but compassion is vastly more important than sacrifice. In other words, the ritual of sacrifice just really can't hold up to the value or the virtue of being compassionate toward other people. And then Jesus says what he wants to even more clearly at the end of verse 13. He says, I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus makes it plain that being with quote-unquote sinners is the essence of his mission. That opens a key passageway for us here. Do everything possible to expose people to Jesus. Matthew's such an intriguing character because his response to his call by Jesus is to invite all of his tax-collecting buddies and other sinners to come meet Jesus. Matthew's not going to fix them. Matthew's not going to change them. Matthew's not even going to require anything of them. All he's doing is placing other people in the presence of Jesus, and that's enough for him. And so in many ways, our work is the same. No qualifiers. There's no entrance exam. There's no screening of individuals. The welcome of the life of the church to individuals doesn't mean assent or acceptance of what's happening or what they're doing in their life. It's a recognition, though, when we welcome them, that that's the only way they're going to meet the person, Jesus, who can bring them healing. So like Matthew, we have to be individuals to say, I'd like you to meet Jesus. And that is what we're trying to do. Jesus is the one that does the saving work. We are not. If we live life like the Pharisees, then we're living in another option. And that option is simply a proclamation, even in the modern day, that Jesus can't redeem certain people. And so we won't let him by keeping them away from the very grace that they need so desperately, just like we need so desperately. The next story that unfolds is really two stories with one of the stories at the beginning at the end and the other story kind of sandwiched into the middle. And so it's a healing within a healing in verses 18 to 26. And it carries some of the themes forward from this calling of Matthew and the dinner that Matthew offers for Jesus, where he welcomes his tax collectors and friends. There's a lot of similarities between these stories. And in verse 18, we read about a man who comes to Jesus and wants a healing from him. Now, both of these healing stories, the one that's at the beginning and the end of this text, and then the other one that's in the middle, both of these stories involve women. Now, this first woman is one who's likely around maybe 11 or 12 years old. The other one is probably much older. We have to remember, before we even read these two stories, that women in the ancient world of Jesus were regarded as far less valuable than men. This is a misogynistic culture. And so the fact that these two stories here center on women is a powerful note in Matthew. We sometimes read past it today in the 21st century culture that we live in, but 2,000 years ago, plus when Jesus was engaged in ministry, to have these two stories that highlight and feature women in such a prominent role is a revolutionary way of storytelling and offering the ministry of Jesus up in a new way. Now, Jesus, it says in verse 18, is approached by what's called a synagogue official. And so why would just not call this person a Pharisee? Well, this person wasn't a Pharisee. This is more than likely the leading lay person or the individual who coordinates the work of the synagogue itself. The rabbi teaches in the synagogue, but this is the person who kind of functions in a way as like the director of the synagogue. Now, in Mark and in Luke, we find the same story about the healing of this man's daughter. And in those Gospels, he's named as Jairus. And in Matthew, he doesn't include his name. He just says he's a synagogue official. And his invitation to Jesus is clear. He says that my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will become alive again. It's clear what he seeks from the beginning. He seeks her resurrection. Now, Mark and Luke, in their versions of the story, they're not quite as clear about what's going on. They don't necessarily frame it as that his daughter has just died. The way they tell the story is that his daughter is sick and near death. And so Jesus, on his way there, encounters this woman we're going to read about in a moment with the hemorrhage, and that delays Jesus' arrival at Jairus' house. And in the intervening time it took Jesus to get there, Jairus' daughter died. In this episode in Matthew's gospel, the synagogue official comes to Jesus, who we believe is Jairus, and now he says, my daughter has just died. So it's a little different way of telling the story. And so he comes to Jesus asking for resurrection, not for the comfort of Jesus, not the explanation of Jesus, not even the presence of Jesus. He wants Jesus to come raise his daughter up from the dead. So it says that Jesus got up and went with him. An unusual request. There's this significance, especially this early in Matthew's gospel. We don't know chronologically where this event actually happened in the life of Jesus, but it's early in Matthew's gospel. So to have this story highlighted here is very powerful and unique, that this man comes seeking resurrection. He believes that Jesus has this capacity. Well, Jesus gets up and leaves, and then on the way there, a strange encounter happens. Jesus encounters a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. Now, this woman comes up to Jesus somewhat unannounced, as we know in the story. She comes forward and simply grabs the hem or the border of his own garment, and it's through that she's healed. Now, this woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, this is important for us to remember what's going on in her own life. By suffering from this form of bleeding she's suffering from, she has, in the ancient world, a ritual uncleanliness. And so it was well known within the Jewish community that when women were in their menstrual cycle, they were considered unclean, as bizarre as that might sound to us today. And because she had continued bleeding, she's probably having some form of uterine bleeding consistent with a menstrual cycle that just simply never stops. She's always engaged in some form of hemorrhaging or bleeding, and it's that bleeding that makes her ritually unclean. And so not only do people stay away from her, she's ostracized and exiled because of her bleeding. It also means that anyone she comes into proximity of and touches, they become unclean. So it's not only people stay away from her, but they stay away from her because she has the capacity to make them ritually unclean because she herself is bleeding. And so she comes to Jesus in this kind of covert sort of approach. The other Gospels tell us that there was a crowd of people gathered around Jesus, and she kind of snuck in on the ground in the middle of the crowd to touch the bottom of his garment. It's not the case here in Matthew's Gospel. He just simply says she comes and touches the bottom of his cloak. Now, Matthew tells the story in such a fascinating way because there's a phrase in here that says, get well or made you well. And it occurs 3 times in this story. So the first time it occurs is the woman's rhetorical reflection. In other words, her self-reflection. It says in verse 21, for she was saying to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will, here's the first occurrence, get well. Then it says, but Jesus turning and seeing her said, daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well. That's the second occurrence of getting or being well. And then the verse concludes with the narrator, Matthew, saying, and at once the woman was made well. This repetition of get well or made well happens 3 times in such a very short telling of the story that what is sought for here is wholeness, and that Jesus gives to her wholeness. He pronounces her wholeness, and she is made whole. So she seeks it, Jesus pronounces it, and then she's found to be made well. There's an interesting mixture here on her part of desperation and devotion. I mean, 12 years she has lived in isolation, estrangement, away from people because of her physical condition. And so she risks everything to find Jesus and to touch his garment. That in and of itself is a scandal and worthy in that day of at least being judged by that community. She risks it all with great courage to come and find Jesus, believing that he has a healing for her. When Jesus addresses her, he uses some interesting language. He says, daughter, to her. This is not a term of condescension. Rather, this is more in the Aramaic speaking world of Jesus. This is a term of affection, a form of belongingness. The first thing Jesus speaks to her is a word of inclusion, not exclusion. So you see where the contrast in comparison comes with the story about the call of Matthew. That in the same way Jesus welcomes the tax collectors and sinners and eats with them and practices a form of inclusion with them, he does the very same thing here. The first word he speaks to this woman is daughter. It's a term of affection, not judgment. And then he says, take courage. And it's a statement affirming the courage that she already has. And then he says, your faith has made you well. Now, note that it's not her faith that has made her well. It's her faith in Jesus that's made her well. She was made well, restored in her own body and restored in her community. So the healing here isn't just that the hemorrhage stopped. Let's please keep this in mind. Because she was alienated and ostracized from her own community, her wellness just isn't her physical healing. It is her communal healing, a spiritual healing, emotional healing at every area of her life. Once this episode is over of this healing of the woman with the hemorrhage, Jesus then finally arrives at the house of the synagogue official who came to him in the first place. And this is quite possibly maybe a what we would call a parsonage or a house next door to the synagogue. And there, when Jesus arrives, he finds flute players and lamenters. In the ancient world of Jesus, one was required to hire these people, flute players and lamenters, for the official work of mourning the person who's dead. And so there's lots of noise going on. Lamenters were hired to be there and to wail and scream and lament the death of a loved one. And so it seems a bit contrived, but culturally this is how it worked. Whereas in our, say American culture, our rituals involve going to a mortuary or a crematorium, and we speak with a funeral director, and there's a certain way in which that interaction happens when we're trying to do that kind of business. So we need to understand that culturally it's different, but it's somewhat of the same processes taking place. When Jesus arrives and all this commotion and all this noise, he tells them all to leave. He says, leave, the girl has not died but is asleep. That word for leave in Greek is the word ekbalo, and it's a verb, and it's a very strong word for leave. It's the word that is used in exorcisms. So when you read these stories about Jesus exorcising a demon out of a person, when he says to leave them or to be cast out, that's ekbalo, to be thrown out. He says the same word here, all of you get out. And then he proclaims that the girl is not dead, but is asleep. But we know she's dead. We know she's dead from what the synagogue official told Jesus at the beginning. My daughter has died. The tense of the verb is important. But just take note here of Jesus' reference point for death. He doesn't refer to it as death, but being asleep, not gone, asleep. There's a way in which Jesus comes into this conversation with what you might describe as an eternal orientation. Well, the crowd responds to Jesus' eternal orientation, that she's not dead but simply asleep, by laughing at him. The crowd rejects Jesus' life orientation. So once they've all left and mocked and laughed and done everything they're going to do, Jesus then, once he has some privacy, it says he takes her by the hand and she got up. It doesn't say he raised her from the dead. It doesn't use any of that kind of language. It simply says he reached out, took her by the hand, and the girl got up. She was alive. This is Jesus' greatest miracle to this point, at least in Matthew's gospel. The raising of Lazarus will come later in the events of Jesus' life. But it points to Jesus' power over death. And then it says news spread throughout the land. Well, no wonder the news spread throughout the land. This is a key passageway for us. Seeking Jesus brings healing and life. Often we're so consumed as followers of Jesus by what we need from God that we simply forget to seek God. Our lists and desires are long for prayer. Each day, for example, I have 20 plus people on my intercessory prayer list. I'm praying for everyday friends, family, my church, my leadership, staff members. Well, one of the hardest things for me to learn in prayer over these years, and continues to be a challenge, is to not pray for what people want or what I want. It's learning how to pray about how every single person can become closer to Christ, how every person can draw near to Jesus. And that's difficult to do because my human sympathy sometimes gets in the way. It sometimes wants me to pray for things for people that may actually not be what is going to draw them closer to Jesus. This is such a fantastic pair of stories here because we learn that we have to learn to seek Jesus, the healer, not the healing of Jesus. Each of these stories highlights the faith of people in Jesus, desperate and even devoted. So we must always be aware to seek the Lord, not what we want from the Lord. If you have comments or reflections, I invite you to reach out to me. You can go to my website, revcraig.com, click on News on the upper right-hand corner, and then Podcast on the drop-down menu, and then you can click on this week's episode and leave a comment. I also encourage you to visit our church's website, ffmc.org, to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.